Harold Castellanos adjusted his weathered tie as he approached the Arlington National Cemetery gates, the morning sun casting long shadows across the manicured grounds. At 78, his steps carried the measured pace of a man who had walked through hell and emerged with stories he rarely shared. The black sedan procession stretched for blocks, filled with generals, colonels, and dignitaries arriving for General Robert Hensley's funeral. Harold's chest tightened as memories flooded back. 43 years had passed since that hellish night in Vietnam when Bobby Hensley was just a green lieutenant, pinned down by enemy fire in a jungle that seemed determined to swallow them whole. Harold touched the small ribbon bar hidden beneath his coat lapel, a habit formed over decades of keeping his Medal of Honor citation private. The crowd thickened near the security checkpoint. Uniformed personnel moved with crisp precision while civilians in expensive suits displayed their credentials with practiced ease. Harold patted his jacket pocket, feeling the worn funeral invitation Bobby had personally sent him 3 months before his passing. The letter had been simple. "Come say goodbye, old friend. You saved my life once. Let me honor yours." Staff Sergeant Marcus Whitfield scrutinized the elderly man approaching his checkpoint with the practiced eye of military security. The old civilian wore a clean but outdated suit that had seen better decades. His silver hair neatly combed, but lacking the precise grooming of the other distinguished guests streaming past. "Excuse me, sir," Whitfield said, stepping forward with his hand raised. "This is a restricted military funeral. I need to see your invitation and identification." Harold reached slowly into his jacket pocket, producing the creased envelope Bobby had sent months ago. Whitfield examined it with growing skepticism, noting the informal handwriting and personal tone that seemed inconsistent with the formal military protocols governing today's ceremony. "Sir, this appears to be a personal note rather than an official invitation," Whitfield said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to enforcing regulations without question. "General Hensley's funeral is limited to military personnel, government officials, and pre-approved family members only." Corporal Janet Rivera stepped beside her supervisor, observing the interaction with professional interest. The checkpoint had processed senators, admirals, and foreign military attaches all morning, each presenting pristine credentials and moving through with obvious belonging. Harold's weathered hands trembled slightly as he held the invitation, decades of memories threatening to overwhelm his composure. "Bobby Hensley and I served together in Vietnam," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of shared history. "He was my lieutenant. I was his sergeant. We went through hell together in the Mekong Delta." Staff Sergeant Whitfield exchanged a skeptical glance with Corporal Rivera, both noting how the old man's story seemed conveniently dramatic. "Sir, with respect, many people claim military connections to gain access to high-profile events," Whitfield replied, his tone growing more dismissive. "General Hensley was a decorated officer who served with distinction across multiple conflicts." Harold straightened his shoulders, muscle memory from decades past bringing him to attention despite his civilian clothes. "The firefight was November 15th, 1979, he continued, his voice steady despite the emotion building behind his eyes. "Charlie Company, 1st Battalion. Lieutenant Hensley was pinned down by enemy mortars when his radio operator was killed." Several funeral attendees began slowing their approach to the checkpoint, curiosity drawing their attention to the unusual confrontation between security and the determined elderly man who spoke with surprising military precision about events from 43 years ago. Whitfield's radio crackled as he called for additional security personnel, his patience wearing thin with what he perceived as an elaborate deception. "We have a potential gatecrasher at Checkpoint Alpha," he reported, eyeing Harold with growing suspicion. Elderly male claiming personal military connection to the deceased. Within minutes, Sergeant First Class Antonio Torres approached with 2 additional military police officers, their presence immediately shifting the atmosphere from bureaucratic inconvenience to potential security threat. Harold noticed how quickly the dynamic changed, recognizing the tactical positioning and alert stances of trained soldiers preparing for possible confrontation. "Sir, you need to step aside and allow these distinguished guests to proceed," Torres said, gesturing toward a group of uniformed officers waiting behind Harold. "This funeral is for invited personnel only, and your documentation appears insufficient for entry." Harold felt the familiar weight of being judged by appearance rather than substance, a sensation he had experienced countless times since returning from combat decades ago. The young soldiers before him saw only an aging civilian in an outdated suit, unable to recognize the warrior who had earned his stripes in jungles they had only read about in military history books. Harold remained perfectly still as the security personnel formed a subtle but unmistakable perimeter around him, their body language radiating authority and barely contained impatience. Despite the mounting pressure, he maintained the composed bearing that had carried him through firefights and prisoner interrogations decades earlier. "I understand your duty, soldiers," Harold said calmly, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had commanded respect without demanding it. "You're protecting an important ceremony, and that's honorable work. But Bobby Hensley was my friend, and I promised his wife I would be here today." Sergeant Torres stepped closer, his frustration evident as more distinguished guests accumulated behind the checkpoint bottleneck. "Sir, we don't have time for stories. Either produce proper credentials or move along. This is a matter of national security, not a social gathering." Harold's eyes met each security officer in turn, recognizing the dedication in their stance, even as they failed to recognize his own service. He had been their age once, convinced that protocol and procedure could capture the full complexity of military brotherhood. Time had taught him that some bonds transcended paperwork, some sacrifices defied documentation, and some warriors earned their place through blood rather than bureaucracy. Colonel Thomas Chun paused mid-conversation with his aide, drawn by the unusual commotion at the security checkpoint. The elderly civilian stood with remarkable composure despite being surrounded by increasingly agitated military police, his bearing suggesting more than his modest appearance revealed. "What's the hold-up, Sergeant?" Chun asked Torres, noting how the checkpoint backup was affecting the funeral's carefully orchestrated timeline. "The ceremony begins in 20 minutes, and we have senators waiting to process." "Sir, this individual claims personal friendship with General Hensley, but lacks proper documentation," Torres replied, his tone reflecting professional frustration mixed with growing doubt about the situation's handling. Several other attendees began forming small clusters nearby, their conversations shifting from ceremony logistics to curiosity about the standoff. A Navy captain whispered to his companion about the old man's military bearing, while a group of junior officers debated whether security was being too rigid in their protocol enforcement. Harold noticed the growing audience. Recognizing faces that belonged to the military community he had served faithfully for decades. Some eyes held sympathy, others suspicion, but all reflected the same question. Who was this persistent stranger, and why did he refuse to simply walk away from what appeared to be an unwinnable confrontation? The distant sound of approaching bagpipes signaled the funeral procession's imminent arrival, adding urgency to the checkpoint standoff that had now drawn the attention of dozens of distinguished guests. Staff Sergeant Whitfield's radio buzzed with increasingly impatient updates from ceremony coordinators demanding the security delay be resolved immediately. "Sir, this is your final warning," Whitfield announced, his hand moving toward the restraints on his duty belt. "Either leave voluntarily or face arrest for trespassing on federal property and disrupting a military funeral. We will not allow this ceremony to be delayed further." Harold felt the familiar weight of injustice that had followed him throughout his military career, moments when doing the right thing put him at odds with those who valued procedure over principle. He remained motionless, understanding that any sudden movement could escalate the situation beyond peaceful resolution. Colonel Chun stepped closer, his instincts telling him something important was being missed in this confrontation. The old man's composure under extreme pressure seemed inconsistent with someone attempting a publicity stunt or seeking unearned attention. His bearing suggested someone accustomed to facing overwhelming odds with quiet determination, a quality Chen recognized from his own combat experience. Harold reached slowly into his inner jacket pocket, his movements deliberately visible to avoid triggering the increasingly tense security personnel. From beneath his coat lapel, he withdrew a small ribbon bar that had remained hidden throughout the confrontation, its distinctive blue field with 13 white stars immediately recognizable to any military professional. "I earned this saving Bobby Hensley's life," Harold said quietly, holding the Medal of Honor ribbon between weathered fingers. November 15th, 1979. "I carried him through 2 miles of enemy territory after his leg was shattered by mortar fragments. He lived because I wouldn't leave him behind." Sergeant Torres scoffed openly, his patience completely exhausted by what he perceived as an elaborate fantasy. "Sir, that's convenient timing, pulling out some ribbon when you're about to be arrested. Anyone can buy military decorations online these days. You expect us to believe you're a Medal of Honor recipient who just happened to show up without proper documentation." Whitfield nodded in agreement, his suspicion confirmed by the dramatic timing of Harold's revelation. "The Medal of Honor is our nation's highest military decoration, not something a real recipient would casually hide in his pocket like a theater prop." The bagpipe procession suddenly ceased its measured cadence, creating an unexpected silence that rippled through the gathering crowd. General Patricia Morrison stepped away from the honor guard formation, her 4 stars gleaming in the morning sunlight as she approached the security checkpoint with purposeful strides that commanded immediate attention. "What's the situation here?" Sergeant Morrison asked, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having problems solved efficiently. "The ceremony cannot proceed with this disruption at our primary security checkpoint." Torres straightened to attention, grateful for senior leadership intervention in what had become an increasingly complicated situation. "Ma'am, we have a civilian claiming friendship with General Hensley and displaying what appears to be a fraudulent Medal of Honor ribbon. He refuses to leave despite lacking proper documentation." General Morrison's eyes moved from the nervous security detail to Harold, who stood with the quiet dignity she had observed in combat veterans throughout her distinguished career. Something in his bearing caught her attention, a familiarity that triggered memories from her early military service when she had studied the faces and stories of America's most decorated heroes. Harold met her gaze directly, recognizing another warrior who had earned her rank through merit rather than politics. General Morrison's expression shifted from professional concern to shocked recognition as memory connected Harold's face to photographs she had studied during her military education. "Harold Castellanos," she whispered, her voice carrying a reverence that immediately silenced the surrounding conversations. The security detail exchanged confused glances as their commanding general's demeanor transformed from authoritative investigation to something approaching awe. Morrison stepped closer to Harold, her trained eye noting the authentic wear patterns on his ribbon bar and the unmistakable bearing of someone who had faced death and emerged with quiet strength. "Sergeant, you have just spent the last 30 minutes harassing one of our nation's most decorated combat veterans," Morrison said, her voice carrying the controlled fury of an officer witnessing gross injustice. Staff Sergeant Harold Castellanos received the Medal of Honor for extraordinary heroism in Vietnam, specifically for saving the life of Lieutenant Robert Hensley under intense enemy fire. Torres felt his stomach drop as the magnitude of their mistake became clear. Whitfield's face drained of color as he realized they had been prepared to arrest a living legend whose sacrifice had preserved the life of the very general they were gathered to honor. Harold simply nodded, his dignity intact despite the ordeal. General Morrison stepped back and brought her right hand to her brow in the crispest salute of her distinguished career, her 4 stars catching sunlight as she rendered honors to the Medal of Honor recipient standing before her. The gesture sent shockwaves through the assembled crowd as hundreds of military personnel and distinguished guests witnessed their commanding general saluting an elderly civilian. Staff Sergeant Castellanos, It is my profound honor to render appropriate recognition to a true American hero, Morrison announced, her voice carrying across the silent gathering. Your courage and sacrifice exemplify the finest traditions of our military service, and your presence here today honors General Hensley's memory. The ripple effect was immediate and dramatic. Colonel Chun snapped to attention and saluted, followed by every military officer within sight. The honor guard formation turned in perfect unison to face Harold, their rifles moving to present arms position as bagpipers prepared to resume their tribute with renewed reverence. Torres and Whitfield stood frozen in mortification, realizing they had nearly arrested the very hero whose actions decades earlier had made today's funeral possible. The security detail that had spent 30 minutes questioning Harold's right to attend now understood they were in the presence of living history. General Morrison personally escorted Harold through the parting crowd, their path lined with saluting officers who now understood they were witnessing a living legend receive his due recognition. The front row, previously reserved for senior government officials, was cleared to accommodate the Medal of Honor recipient whose heroism had preserved General Hensley's life decades earlier. As Harold took his place of honor, Morrison addressed the gathered assembly. Ladies and gentlemen, we are privileged to have Staff Sergeant Harold Castellanos with us today. On November 15, 1979, his extraordinary courage under enemy fire saved Lieutenant Robert Hensley's life, carrying him 2 miles through hostile territory despite overwhelming odds. The bagpipes resumed their haunting melody as Harold sat with quiet dignity, finally receiving the respect his service had always deserved. Torres and Whitfield stood at attention nearby, their earlier skepticism replaced by profound understanding of how easily heroism can be overlooked when it doesn't match our expectations. The ceremony proceeded with renewed meaning, honoring not just General Hensley's distinguished career, but also celebrating the brotherhood that transcends rank and time. If you enjoyed this story of hidden military courage, please drop a comment about your favorite moment, or share if you've witnessed similar heroism that almost went unrecognized.